Welcome, everybody. Thanks again for attending this great conference, and we've got a great topic and presenter that's going to talk next. His name is Simon Bown. He's from England or the UK. And Simon's going to talk about reincarnation. And he sent a little dialogue in prep for this where he said, reincarnation has been a belief for many people around the planet for thousands of years. But where is the evidence of the reality of reincarnation? In this presentation, Simon will look at startling cases of children with past life memories, veridical past life regressions, and spontaneous past life memories. Simon will also look at what people who have had near-death experiences have to say about reincarnation. Simon will discuss the possible reasons we are all going through a continuing cycle of rebirth and what the goal of all this is. Now, Simon is a diploma in clinical hypnotherapy and is certified in past life regression therapy. He has had many paranormal experiences, including psychic flashes, UFO sightings, and a number of strange events not explained easily. He took part in his first past life regression in 1987 at the College of Psychic Studies in London. Elements of the past life viewed in this session were later verified. Simon has produced over 150 episodes of the Past Life podcast. I personally tune into that. It's awesome, by the way. Each episode is an hour-long interview with researchers and people who have had amazing experiences. The podcast looks into reincarnation, near-death experiences, and other phenomena suggestive of the afterlife. Almost every guest has published a book, and Simon has read all of them, which has contributed to his in-depth knowledge on the subjects covered. Before I turn this over to him, just a couple of things. Please go to the chat area if you'd like to ask Simon a question. There will be a question and answer period at the end of this, at the end of his presentation. And also, if you'd like to enter where you're actually listening to this presentation from, we would love to hear that. And without further ado, from the United Kingdom, Simon, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Robert. That was a nice introduction, and it's nice to hear that stuff about yourself. I hope I can live up to it. So I'm going to split this into 3 different sections, with the first one being children with past life memories that can that have seemed to have brought through something of some kind of physical mark on their body. So it's not just that they have a physical mark, but they have a past life memories linked to that as well. And in the second section, I'm going to look at past life regression, where somebody who's had a past life regression will later investigate the information that came through and can prove that that life actually existed. And I'll be focusing on one particular case for that. And then to finish off, we'll be looking at what near-death experiences learned about reincarnation when they had their near-death experience, whether it was communication from some kind of entity, their spirit guides that they met there, or just something that they seemed to find out. Because it seems that sometimes when people have a near-death experience, they just seem to know so much stuff. But the problem is when they come back to Earth, they usually forget most of it. So first of all, I'm going to start off talking about some work that Ian Stevenson's done. I'm focusing on this book here, where reincarnation and biology intersect. And most of you will probably know that Ian Stevenson was a professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Perceptual Studies. And he investigated children with past life memories for decades. And he met so many of these children himself and interviewed them and their families. And he had, before he died, over 2,600 cases that he had investigated. And of course, this investigation continues at the university, with Dr. Jim Tucker being one of the people there who has also written a couple of great books, and he's known for investigating some great cases. So the first one I'm going to talk about from this book is somebody called Bibi Saxena, and they were born in Bareilly in India in 1918. And at his birth, he was very fair in complexion compared to the rest of his family. His hair was almost white and his eyes were brown. He started to talk about a previous life when he was between 3 and 4 years old. And he said his name was Arthur, and that he'd been a soldier who died in what he called the German War. So I suppose in 1918, just when he was born, that was the end of the First World War, and they hadn't had the Second World War yet. So perhaps that is how they referenced the First World War. And he said that in the previous life, he had 2 brothers and a mother, and a father had died long ago. Now, he had 2 prominent birthmarks, one on his neck, which was roundish, looked somewhat like a bullet wound ventry, and another, a hairless scar-like area at the top of his head. And he claimed that he was a captain in the army, and he died in a battle while he was on horseback. And when he talked about his death, he often pointed to the birthmark on his neck as he mentioned this. So what I'm going to do is show you a picture of Bibi Saxena. And there you can see on his neck that birthmark that he says was related to his death in the previous life. And he said that in the previous life, he'd been married to an English wife, and they lived in a house with a kitchen and employed a cook. And when he was small, he often played at being a soldier, and he strutted up and down, and he was giving military orders to the family. And he also liked to play games that were totally unknown to his Indian family, these kind of English games like leapfrog and hopscotch. Also, he hated wearing Indian clothes, such as the dhoti, and he wanted to wear shorts instead. And for food, he asked for bread and butter instead of the Indian bread chapati. And although his family were vegetarians, he asked for meat. And so all these kind of things are very, I suppose, Western, very English. And they're not part of his upbringing. These things were spontaneously coming to him. He would say these things to his family. And he did not use his right hand to eat food. He would call his mother and say, I want a knife and a fork and a spoon, you know. And it's interesting that the British Army had a small base in the town of Bareilly during the period that we're talking about here. And some of the soldiers from that base fought in France in the First World War. So is it possible that the soldier was based in Bareilly, where Saxena was born, went off and was killed in the First World War in France, but somehow the spirit returned to that area of India and was reborn into Bibi Saxena? So that's just the first case that I'll be talking about. And the next one, this is a young girl called Marwin Tar, who was born in Burma in 1962. And at her birth, she was found to have these marks on her arms. It's a kind of prominent ring around her left wrist. And when closely examined, it showed that it had consisted of 3 separate depressions that might correspond to grooves made by a rope wound around the arm 3 times. And so I'll just show you this picture. This is her arm. Now, her mother said that there had been a similar rope-like mark above Marwin Tar's right wrist, but this had since faded. And she also said that when Marwin Tar was younger, it was possible to discern this. There was an area, a pattern within the birthmarks that corresponded to strands of rope. So she started to speak when she was only about 1.5 years old. And when she was about 3, she began to refer to a previous life. She said that she'd been a Japanese soldier and she'd been captured by some Burmese villagers, tied to a tree and then executed. She gave no name for herself in the previous life, and her account remains unverified. It is plausible, however, because in that area of Burma, as the Japanese army retreated and the British advanced, some Burmese villagers would sometimes capture Japanese soldiers. And these stragglers, these German soldiers, were treated quite badly by the villagers. because they'd been this quite nasty occupying army. So I'm just going to stop sharing this. So she showed all sorts of behavior that was unusual in her family, but appropriate for the previous life that she claimed. She liked to dress like a boy and to wear shirts and trousers. She also liked to keep her hair short like a boy's. And eventually her family forbade her from wearing boys' clothes and insisted she dress like a girl. She showed several behaviors that you could call Japanese traits. She complained that the food was too spicy and refused to eat the spicy foods. And she liked sweet foods and pork. She was quite insensitive to pain and more hardworking than the average Burmese child. And she had a streak of cruelty rare in Burmese children, and she sometimes slapped the faces of her playmates when they annoyed her. But this was a habit that the Japanese soldiers often showed with Burmese villagers that irritated them. She also resisted learning the forms of worship practiced by Burmese. And when she was young, she would sit on the ground with her knees forward and her buttocks on her heels, just as Japanese people do. And her behavior certainly made her stand out among her siblings and other playmates. One day, when some people came from Japan to visit the Japanese war graves, she said, "These are my nationals." And she said, "I am Japanese. What do you think of me?" So there's another interesting case. She's got physical marks on her arms that correspond to what could have been a traumatic death. Just as the previous case, Bibi Saxena had a mark on his neck and his head that could correspond to the traumatic death that he talked about. And so the third case that I would talk about, this is Mong Zawin Ong, who was born in Make Tilla in Burma in 1950. And almost as soon as he could speak, he said that he had been an American aviator whose bomber had been shot down and crashed near the town. He said he and a companion in the airplane, we're not sure if he was the pilot or the co-pilot, they remembered being shot down, and he would later play at being a pilot of an airplane. There were a number of statements he made about his previous life, which were unusual for a small boy in Burma who had no contact with the outside world. He said that his name was John Stevens, and he said how he and his fellow pilots would drink alcohol often, sometimes when they were on bombing missions. He could not describe the airplane he had been in when it crashed, nor state the military unit, so the life has not been verified. But he did remember that the airplane he flew was not based in Burma. And this is plausible because American fighter bombers were stationed at a base in Calcutta in India, and they aided the British as they advanced through Burma against the Japanese army. So it's quite possible that an American bomber was shot down over this part of Burma. He was nostalgic for America and said he would return there if he could. And he said America was a much better place to live than Burma. He expressed anger at the Japanese, and he always wanted to wear Western type clothing like shoes and trousers. He was fascinated with aeroplanes and said he would later become a fighter pilot. Again, he was another one of these children. He resisted taking food to his mouth with his hands and insisted on using a spoon. And he didn't like the spicy Burmese food and often asked for milk and biscuits. He would sometimes have behavior changes when he was young. At times, he would speak boastfully about the bombing raids in which he had participated. And then at other times, his attitude would swing to repentance and say that he had sinned in killing so many people. He seemed to want the Buddhist monks to give him absolution for his war crimes. Something else that is interesting about him is his color. And I'll just get him on the screen for you to take a look at. Let me see. So I hope you can see that. There he is on the left. On the right-hand side is the translator that was working with Professor Ian Stevenson. And you can see that if he was native to Burma, he would be the same color as the interpreter. But you can see he has such light skin, blonde hair, looks very Western. And it's another interesting thing where something physical may have come through from a previous life and affected the body in the next life. Now, when he was about 10 years old, his mother dreamed that a Western woman came to her and asked to be born into her family so that she could be near her brother. His mother was pregnant at the time of the dream, and she later gave birth to a blonde girl who was named Dolly. Dolly also had light skin and was quite blonde. Dolly never spoke about a previous life, although she did exhibit some Western traits, such as preferences for food, manner of eating, and the clothing that she wanted to wear. She was also very strongly attached to her brother, and he was very attached to her. So those are just three of the cases in this book, and this book is packed with these cases, and there's many more photographs in the middle. And it's interesting because I've talked to other near-death experiencers that talk about an energy that when I was doing the podcast and I talked to them, and particularly I remember talking to Natalie Sudman, who talked about working on her body with two kind of spirit guides, and they're using an energy. And she said there was a kind of a matrix there. And I've heard a suggestion that your soul, your spirit might have some kind of a energy matrix, and that when it joins the body for its next incarnation, this matrix may imprint something from the previous life. And it's interesting that many of the deaths that the children talk about, a high percentage of them are traumatic deaths. And there may be something about the traumatic death which is linked to the likelihood that some child will remember their past life, as though if you have a comfortable death at old age in bed, you're not going to remember it. It's as though their life was cut short, perhaps. So next, I'm going to move on to talking about past life regression, and where there's possible lives that you might see during a past life regression and then go on to verify them. And something like this has happened to me on a small level 2 or 3 times. When I did my first past life regression back in 1987, somebody took me through it. And I was a small girl in London in about 1895, and I was in a park, and it was on a very steep slope, this park, and it was, you know, it was odd. It was like if you were a town planner and you found this steep slope, you wouldn't think, hey, this is a great place for a park. And I got to this place in North London where I'd never been before. This was a few years after the regression, and there was the park exactly as I'd seen it in the past life regression. And the houses that were going around this park were exactly the houses that I'd seen in this past life regression, these big Victorian townhouses. And later on in that life, I saw myself as a nurse in the First World War. And I recently Googled First World War British nurses' uniforms, and that was exactly as I'd seen them in the past life regression. Although you could argue I might have seen that on TV or in the movies at some point. And these kind of small verifications are very powerful for me. They might not be so powerful when you hear them, me just talking about them. They could be easily dismissed. But I think that in a way, for me, it's some kind of spiritual awakening experience. And I think there are people that go through life like me who have lots of little experiences, and they kind of build up and build up and build up. And then there are people who might have a near-death experience and they get the whole thing in one go, this whole awakening. So what I thought I would do was focus on one particular book. This guy is Robert Snow, and he was a guest on my podcast. He was such a great guest. And I'll just bring his book cover on screen for you. He was such a great talker, and it was so interesting to talk to him. So you should be able to see his book cover there. So the thing about Robert was that for 38 years, he was in Indianapolis Police Department, and he was a homicide detective. And he eventually retired at the rank of commander in the homicide branch. And he used his skills in investigation to track down this past life that he saw during a past life regression. Now, what's interesting is that he was a skeptic. He didn't want to do this. And it was a colleague in the precinct who would badger him and say, oh, you should try this thing, it's great. And he was very much a kind of atheist, materialist. He thought it was all nonsense. But he said after a while, it started to get silly that he'd be walking down the hallway in the precinct and he'd see this person come and he'd quickly dive in an office to avoid them. And so he thought, you know what, I'm just going to do this. I'll go and do the past life regression. I'll prove they can't hypnotize me. I'll prove it's all a load of rubbish. And then that's it. We'll be done with it. But he went to this past life regression. He was hypnotized and he had quite a powerful past life regression. We saw all these different scenes. And so in the book where he says it started off where he found himself on a city street, but it was obviously not a city street from the current times. He said it was lit with gas lamps and it looked like the 19th century and there were carriages being pulled by horses. And he thought to himself, that's funny, I'm wearing a fancy shirt and jacket. And he looked down, he says, my shoes are real shiny. I'm carrying a cane, but I'm not an old man. It's like a fancy cane, more of a status symbol. And he felt that he was on his way to meet someone. And he said, she's waiting for me on the corner. She's very beautiful. And it's Amanda. And he said, suddenly some information came to his mind. And he just goes, my name's Jack. And next he saw himself in a blurry room, lighting all around. And it was stifling hot. And he could see these objects in the room. And he said, everything looked a little out of focus. But it's full of windows and skylights. And it's really bright. And the paintings, the whole place is full of paintings. And then eventually the hypnotherapist directed him forward in time and said, your body has died. You can see your soul leaving the body. And he said, a moment later, I found myself looking down through the windows on the second or third floor of a large mansion, apparently floating there. And I could see one of my paintings. It was hanging above a fireplace. It's got a big yellow circle in it. It's a bottle with some fruit around it. It's like there's a big sun there. And so he went through this past life regression. I saw all sorts of scenes. And he said, I'm painting a portrait of someone. And he could see he had a paintbrush in his hand. And there was a woman who sat very stiff with a raised, actually hunched shoulders posing for him. And he could see that she was apparently a hunchback. And he got this feeling, I don't like doing portraits, but I need the money, he said. And so he saw himself in a big garden. And then he thought he saw himself in a building in France. And then next he said, they said she died of a blood clot, but he wasn't sure where that came from. So then he finished the regression and he was moving on and he thought it was all nonsense, but he wanted to prove it was nonsense. And he told himself that this went totally against everything he'd always believed in. And he couldn't accept that they were dredged up past life memories, because that would mean his whole belief system would have to be rebuilt. And so he decided that the pictures that he'd seen in the past life regression must have been part of a big exhibition by a famous author, and that his subconscious had somehow just dragged them up. So what he did was he developed a plan, and he decided that he would do his investigation and he would find this stuff and he would prove that he had seen the paintings earlier, that it was all made up and that his subconscious was just playing tricks on him. So he started visiting the library, and he said he visited the Central Library in Indianapolis, which had an extensive collection of art books. And he went there almost every single lunchtime. And after several weeks of work and several hundred art books, he found nothing. So eventually he came to the conclusion he needed to expand his search. Yet after several more weeks of tedious searching through the paintings of famous artists from the 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries, he still hadn't found either painting. After another month and a half of lunchtime searching and an occasional day off spent at the library, looking through all sorts of books of lesser known famous artists, he finally had to stop the investigation for a while and reconsider his plan. And he was starting to become obsessed with this, and his wife was starting to get annoyed with him. She was something of an atheist as well. And then show how old he is, how long ago this happened. There was no internet in those days. He got out Yellow Pages and a street map of Indianapolis and started looking for all the art stores and galleries. And he doubled his search and systematically visited all the locations. But after 2 months, after reviewing every art book in the library's collection and after visiting every art store, he found nothing. And so he went back to the hypnotherapist for a second hypnotic session to go back to that life and try and get more information. But it didn't happen. He went to another life, and the hypnotherapist said to him, Apparently, already you know everything you need to know about that life. So he told himself over and over that even though he couldn't prove that what he had experienced were just dredged up silly memories from his subconscious, he also had no proof that it was anything else, and that he should just forget about the whole experience and get on with his life. And it was a little while later, his wife suggested to him that they go to New Orleans for their anniversary. And it was on the 5th and final day in New Orleans, they went to a small area of the French Quarter called Royal Street, where they found several blocks of art galleries. I'll just move on to my next document here. So they walked along the street, and the galleries had some copies of famous paintings, and the further they got along the street, the smaller the galleries were. And he went upstairs at one of these galleries to these unknown artists and small paintings. And there in the corner, holding a portrait, was the picture of the hunchback woman that he had seen during his past life regression. And he said that he'd once had an experience where he grabbed onto a live wire without knowing it, and the current was froze him in his tracks. And it was this huge voltage surged up and down his legs. And he said he felt almost the same thing. He said he simply stood frozen in the art gallery for what seemed like a long time, electricity racing up and down his arms as he stared at the portrait of the hunchback woman. He thought this must be something going wrong. How did this woman turn up? And since it was in a gallery, he thought, wow, it must be a famous artist. I must have seen it before. It was then a salesman came over to him and said, the artist's name is Beckwith, and that the artist had lived from 1852 to 1917, and that his first name was Jay. And Robert Snow thought that was odd, because he remembers during the regression, he said, hey, my name is Jack. And Mr. Beckwith was born in Missouri and lived for most of his life in New York City, but had studied in Paris under a painter named Duran. And also he remembered during the past life regression, he thought, hang on, I think I'm in France. So Robert Snow asked the salesman, has this painting ever been exhibited anywhere, in a museum maybe? I think I've seen it before. The salesman said, no, you haven't seen this before. This portrait's been in a private collection for years. And besides, let me be honest with you, I don't think there's been an exhibition of Beckwith's work for over 75 years. So how could he have seen this painting in the past life regression if there's been no exhibition for 75 years and it's been in a private collection? But now he had a name, J. Carroll Beckwith. That was the name of the artist. So he had a way that he could start investigating him. So there'd been no exhibitions of his work since 1911. He started going to the library and looking for J. Carroll Beckwith, and had a lot of difficulty and couldn't find him. And all this that I'm telling you now is just showing you that Robert Snow was really looking for this artist. Because one of the criticisms of past life regression is what you see in your past life may come from somewhere else. You might have just seen it on TV or read about it in a book or seen it in a movie, and it's not actually past life. But what Robert Snow was doing was going right in depth into this person's life and successfully finding so much stuff. He realized at this point that he had little information, and he started searching. He found a book on the artist John Singer Sargent, had a notation that said the information concerning an anecdote about Sargent came from the diary of Beckwith. So then Robert Snow started searching for the diary of Beckwith to see if he could gain more information that would tally with his past life regression. And in the end, he came up with 28 proofs, 28 things that he'd seen in the past life regression that he wanted to prove were real. Things such as, did he die in the fall of the year? Did he die in a large city? Did he and his wife spend some time in France? Did he paint portraits but hate it? Did him and his wife argue about money? Did he play the piano? And as he went through his investigation, he eventually proved 26 of the 28. And of the other two, there were vague suggestions that it was real. And one day I had a conversation with his wife, and she said to him, let's just suppose for a second that you're right about all of this past life stuff. I'm not saying that you are, but just suppose you are. So what? What good is knowing all of this? What difference does it make? And he said it makes a hell of a lot of difference. No one's ever done this before. As far as I know, no one's ever had absolute proof of past life memories before. And I've got more proof than in most murder cases. So he had the microfilmed pages of the diary sent to him, and he went through that and he found so much more information that tallied with thoughts and feelings and things he'd seen during the past life regression. And this was very powerful for him. And it's great that he went on to write this book and to get the publicity that he's had. TV stations have talked to him, and he's been in all sorts of media. He's been interviewed in magazines, and he was interviewed in something called NUVO. I'm not sure what it is, but apparently the police administration where he was working were quite concerned, but they didn't do anything. And then a few months later, there was a segment about Beckwith, which appeared on Proof Positive. And soon after this, the police department abruptly removed him from his position as commander of the homicide branch and transferred him to the Citizens Service Desk, the office where the public comes when they want to be fingerprinted or obtain a police report. And this spot is usually reserved for captains just getting ready to retire. But he wasn't ready to retire, and they'd moved him there without him asking. So it was clear that bringing this spotlight on himself as being a police detective who believed in past lives was causing the police administration a problem. And eventually he did retire. So next he went on and he found Beckwith's grave, and he went to visit it. And he said he felt perfectly normal that day. He drove up there and he got out the car and went into the graveyard. But when he found the tombstone, the closer he got to it, the more he started to shake and shiver. And he said he's normally quite a tough guy and quite a grounded guy because, you know, he's a police detective and it takes a lot to scare him. But he found that he got so shook up standing by that grave of a previous life. He just could not explain it. And he hasn't been back there since. And this is just one of several past lives that have been verified in various places. And when I take people through past life regressions, we see so much stuff. And I think that this goes to show that there's definitely something going on. If we look at the past lives of children and we see these body marks that come through, and we look at past life regression and lives that are verified like this really does, for me, suggest very strongly that there's something definitely happening with reincarnation and something definitely happening with the afterlife. Because where do we go when we die before our next incarnation? And one of the interesting lives is James Leiniger, which a lot of you have probably heard of. And he had some between lives memories. And one of them was that he said he saw his parents on a beach having dinner outside a big hotel that was pink. And that's when he chose them to be his parents. And the interesting thing is that his parents say before he was born, they did have dinner and they stayed at a big pink hotel in Hawaii. And they were on the beach. And it was that dinner when they decided that they would start trying for a child. So there's a fascinating connection there between those. So the next thing I'm going to go on to is talking about near-death experiences who learned something about about reincarnation during their experiences. So the first one is Eben Alexander. And all of this information that I'm going to give you is from episodes of my podcast. So these are things that I discussed myself with these people. And you know, Eben Alexander is the famous neurosurgeon from Harvard Medical School. He's a professor there. And he had a very interesting near-death experience. So I'm going to tell you what he said to me when I asked him about reincarnation. He said, now the thing that's important to point out, of course, is my coma journey showed me very clearly that reincarnation must be a big part of the phenomenon. And that was shown in many different ways. Part of that was to make any sense of this infinitely loving, powerful, and all-knowing deity, this God force that I encountered, especially in the setting of suffering of innocents like children and animals. If you only have one incarnation, some of those horrific cases of a life snuffed out at an early age through no fault of their own, leaves it wide open of how an infinitely loving and powerful God could allow for that to happen. So it was clear to me from my coma that reincarnation helped to explain a lot of things. There's all sorts of choices that our souls have to make, and some of those choices to help the higher good, some of those choices made out of fear, many of those choices made out of love for self and others. And that's why we are here to learn and to teach through those choices, and realizing that much bigger kind of stage setting for the psychological drama of multiple incarnations is how you then start to make sense of this lifetime. And if you think of hypnotic regression as psychic mediums and meditation going into mindset and exploring past life memories and things like that, all of those are very valid ways to try and make bigger sense of this and make a bigger sense of our journeys in these physical bodies, to acknowledge that they're not just one incarnation, birth to death. So that's Eben Alexander's view from when he was going through his near-death experience, this kind of knowledge that he gained about reincarnation. This is Jeffrey Olson. And he had this to say about reincarnation. When I was a very young man before my accident, even before I married Tamra, I was in Scotland. I was near Stirling. I knew nothing of the history, didn't know anything about it. And I was completely overcome with emotion and with the clearest sense that I had been there before. And as a young man, I thought, what's happening? I had to sit on the park bench and I shed tears. And you know, that's a residual energy of the battles or things that took place there. But for whatever reason, I had this incredible remembrance. I've had this since I've done some interesting past life regressions. I've had vivid experiences during those things of ancient different times. I even had an Egyptian experience at one point. I had a Native American experience. So I'm completely open to the possibility that if I know we're eternal, and that was what came to me very clear then, of course, we're going to have many, many lives. And that's interesting because Tricia Barker said this to me when she was on the podcast. She said when she was in Boston, and this is after her near-death experience, she remembered everything that was before 1920. So I just knew the town. And so I was pretty certain that I'd lived there before, and that that was my last life before this one, and that I had died as an older woman. And I remembered the floors that I had were marble floors and what my life had been like before that. And I even remembered my dying wish was to come back and to experience more freedom and more artistic freedom. And I guess the ability to just be a woman in society and express myself artistically and be taken seriously, because I think I had all these wishes in that life that I didn't get to fulfill. And I was giving away money to younger people who wanted to be artists and just supporting them in my final years. And so I thought, that's interesting. I just remembered so much. And I get a really clear image of how I looked and who I was. So I know I was born in San Francisco, and I know much of that life. And then I married someone a bit older who died before me and left me a nice house. But I never had kids. And it's interesting how she gained so much information there. So now I'm going to move on to Natalie Sudman. She was such a fantastic guest, so interesting. And her book is so detailed when it goes into her near-death experience and what happened. And she was a private contractor with the US Army in Iraq, and a roadside bomb went off next to her truck. And this is what led to her near-death experience. And I asked her if she'd learned anything about reincarnation during her near-death experience. And she said, yeah, it felt like I'd been here a lot of different times. And I think that it could be understood in different ways, depending upon your perspective. So I can perceive it from, let's say, the near-death experience environment and say that, yes, I, as a whole being, have incarnated into human bodies many, many times. And that doesn't mean that I bring the same attributes or the same personality into each of those beings. Each of those incarnations, I may have a little bit different personality, because the personality is like a little collection of attributes that I choose to take with me into that incarnation in order to use them for whatever I'm exploring in that incarnation. But it's almost like, I've described it as a bicycle wheel, and it's almost like the whole self is the bicycle wheel, the whole thing. And each of the incarnations is one of the spokes. And so each of those spokes is part of the whole, but it's not necessarily all of the whole, and it's intrinsic to the whole. And so when you look at it, it's kind of like the wheel exists at one moment, and all the spokes exist at one moment, and each of the different spokes is a different life. So not from what Natalie's saying, but from my point of view looking at it, and when we hear about near-death experiences saying that time doesn't exist in that space, does that also mean that the soul is experiencing every single lifetime it has in the same moment? And if they are experiencing everything in the same moment, can they influence each other? Can we have the parallel lives? And if you're in a past life regression and you'll get some kind of a healing from viewing something in a past life, are you getting a direct connection to a life which is actually ongoing while you're having the near-death, the past life regression? And similarly, does that mean if somebody gets a healing in a past life, it can affect you in this life? So if all the lives are occurring at the same time in the same moment, that is what can make up the soul. Obviously, there's a lot more to a soul than just past lives. So she said, from that perspective, as you look at it, from the perspective of the wheel, they would all be happening at the same time. And then the whole self or the soul can choose to move its focus of attention to any one of those spokes at any time. And it's difficult for us to conceive of that as humans, to have that kind of viewpoint and that ability to focus on all these different things all at once and to be able to take in all that experience. So now I'm going to talk about something Pim van Lommel said, and he's a researcher in the Netherlands who's done a lot of research in reincarnation. And I asked him about, had any of his research led him to look into reincarnation? And he says he mentioned it fairly shortly in his book. And he says he's only met 2 or 3 people who are talking about a previous life, but he thinks that there is a continuity of consciousness. And so if your consciousness does not end when the body dies, is it possible the consciousness is somewhere in the non-local reality? And it should be possible that people come back. Aspects of this higher self can be in a new body. And he says that he's quite convinced and that there is a kind of reincarnation, but he doesn't know exactly for sure. But that is something I would agree with him. I don't think any of us know exactly for sure, do we? So let's look at Nancy Rhines. She was a guest on the podcast and she was such a great guest. And I highly recommend her book as she brings some kind of messages back from the spirit guide that were given to her for her life, but also she was asked to carry them forward to everyone else. And so you can read what happens in her near-death experience and all these amazing things, but also the messages are there. And I think each chapter from, say, chapter 10 to chapter 22 is one of these messages. And she goes in depth about how you can take on these things that the spirit guide told her to live a happier life and to treat people better. So this is what she said when I asked her about reincarnation. I came into this particular life to make amends for something I'd done in a prior life. So I had a lot of karma to clear up. But really for me, it was about making amends, making things right as much as I could. My spirit guides only really showed me a couple of specific past lives that dealt with the one that I'm in now. And of the 2, I was able to see, in one of them, I was a military leader of some kind and caused a lot of havoc. And it seemed a long time ago. So it seemed like it was millennia ago. And then the other was, interestingly, a life on another planet. But I didn't get to see a lot of detail in that one. It was really more about seeing that civilization and not necessarily my specific life, although I was told that I had lived there. I couldn't say which sky you could look at and see a star. It was kind of an opening or a kind of teaching me that there was life elsewhere and not just here. So that leads on to a whole other subject of being regressed to past lives on other planets, which happens spontaneously, certainly to some of my clients. And that's a whole other kettle of fish to go into. So I also interviewed Lynn Russell, who's a great researcher. And I asked her that there was about some people she talked about in her book that had a life review, and they reviewed more than one life during that life review. And she said they sometimes do it because it relates to this life. And it may be that, and she says she's just guessing, but it may be because the life that they had before, there was unfinished business that they had tried to complete, and they have to try and complete it in this life. And so all the lives in the life review that they see would have to be linked together. And she said this absolutely leads to the idea of reincarnation. She said it wasn't even a question. It was just automatic. Of course, there's reincarnation. We've all had many, many lives, like thousands of lives. She says there was one boy in her book, when he was having his near-death experience, when they told him he had to come back, he said to the guides, no, 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 I don't want to come back. And they said, well, you know, you have to. It's too bad. That's the way it is. So he said, okay, when I come back home, the next time, I'm not going to leave again. I'm not going to reincarnate again. And they said to him, oh, yes, you will. You love coming back. You love the experience of having a lifetime. And so obviously that suggests two different types of perspective, which is something that's interesting, where you have this perspective that your soul has and the perspective that you have as your current personality, your current individual. You may look at the life you're leading on earth currently and be thinking, oh, boy, I'm not doing this again. There's too much hard work. There's too much stress. But then there's the higher self, the superconscious. So your soul is overlooking the life and is learning so much for it, and might be looking at your current life saying, this is good for you're experiencing what I need to grow as a soul. And that all the other lives that you've lived have helped me grow as a soul. And that's kind of suggesting two different consciousnesses, two different people, two different, like the soul and your current self, but you are part of the soul. And when you return, you'll slowly, I think, be integrated. But it's a hard thing to describe. And these are concepts that I've picked up over time through doing all these different podcast episodes and talking to all these different people, that, you know, that this is all guesswork, I think. And like I said before, I don't know everything 100%. So I've got a small document here from somebody called Yvonne Cason from when she was a guest on my podcast. And I asked her about reincarnation. And she talks about all sorts of things. I've got a lot here, actually. I think it's too much. She said, in the realm of pure thought, as this is vast, an amount of information flowing in at once, I was able to perceive, remember, recall, and integrate many past lives. And to me, the experience would be like I had glimpses of some of my past lives while I was still embodied, and they were like having pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So I'd have various pieces before, but now in this aha experience, in this realm of pure thought, of pure consciousness, it was like all the jigsaw puzzle pieces were put together perfectly. So they all fit, plus other pieces that I'd not been aware of. And I could see the whole picture, and I could see my soul's journey and how it made sense over these many incarnations, my various experiences, how they all fit together perfectly. And my life as Dr. Yvonne Cason had this particular form that was like, suddenly this all makes sense to me in this big experience. So it's fascinating to see these connections. And I've seen so many connections by interviewing so many people during the podcasts or episodes that I've done. And it's not just connections between near-death experiences and past life regression and reincarnation, but also talking to experts in deathbed visions, where people who are coming close to death will have visits from dead relatives. And sometimes they see things. They might see an angel in the room. They might talk about children that they see playing outside the window that aren't there. And they're seen having conversations with people that aren't there. And there's that whole idea that when you're dying, that they come to collect you. And I think it was Dr. Christopher Kerr that I was talking to about this. And he was saying that, I asked him about what some people report straight after they die in a near-death experience is very similar to deathbed visions. And that is kind of the case. And it was interesting. He said some people got close to death, but then got some kind of physical boost, and they moved away from death and they were able to go home from the hospice. And that they'd still had those deathbed visions when they were getting close to death. And how, it was weird how that came together. And I've talked to mediums about how information comes through to them, and they've had certain information on reincarnation. So it's all like all these different things, including UFOs as well, and alien abductions. It's like each of those different things are part of a puzzle, and that jigsaw comes together. And so we see that with near-death experiences having certain after effects like having amazing synchronicities, not being able to wear watches, lights malfunctioning around them, having psychic flashes, having a big change in their personality that might even cause them problems in life. But the interesting thing is that people who said they've been abducted by aliens, and some of them talk about many abductions over years, they have exactly that same list of after effects. And so some people say that the near-death experience is a spiritually transformative experience. We can also see that in some way being abducted by aliens is also a spiritually transformative experience. And it's only recently, in the last few years, that I think there's been some knowledge and some investigation in this kind of a crossover. I had a guest on the podcast who talked about waking up one night and standing next to the bed, and there were 3 or 4 grey ETs at the foot of her bed, and she was a bit freaked out, and she looked back and she saw her body was still in the bed. It was like she was having an out-of-body experience, moving, as she said it, into the astral plane. And then as soon as she realized that, she was back in her body and awake, and the room was empty. So it was like the ETs were in the astral plane, which you might suggest is the afterlife plane. And if that's the case, what do they know about it? Because there's some people who've been abducted by aliens who complain to them about, you've got no right to take me, you can't do this to me. And the aliens say, but you agreed to this before you were born. We sat down, you have a contract that you said, yeah, during this life, I will help you out with what you're doing here. And I interviewed a lady recently on the podcast. She has a book called The Dual Soul Connection. And she remembered past lives as a grey alien. And she brought part of that life into this life with her. That's why the book's called The Dual Soul Connection. Part of her grey alien life was brought into her consciousness with her human life, and that she hadn't really had the human life before. And it was interesting how it all connected up. So if all of these things are connected, and there's verification from the children, verification from past life regressions, you get people who have near-death experiences who see things that are later verified. This kind of evidence shows that there really is something going on. There is some kind of an afterlife, and they are all connected. But I think everybody has different ideas of what this means and what these experiences are. And there is talk of angels, and my interviewing, some people talks about angels and their near-death experience. That I ask, what did they look like? And quite often they say, well, they don't have huge wings and a robe and are carrying a harp, and they just kind of energetic beings who are there to help, and they want to, only the best for mankind, and they're energetic beings that have never been incarnated as humans. But also there was one man who was having his near-death experience, and he was over his body, and he'd been told he had to return, and the angels were there. And he said to him, but I'm so big, how am I going to fit in that tiny little body? And he was kind of in awe of these angels. And the angels are like, are you crazy? We're in awe of you. You've had a human life. And it was interesting to see, there's that viewpoint that perhaps if these incredible angels are really there, and they're these magnificent light beings, that you might think, my God, they're so superior to us. But actually, they might be on the same level as us, and us as souls are something really incredible. So anyway, I've come to the end of my presentation. So if I could hand back to the guys there and see if there's any questions coming through.
Sure. Thank Simon. That was absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We do have quite a few questions here and comments. And I'm going to start with one that I started, and there's probably been 5 or 6 other questions very similar to it. About reincarnation. Is there an estimated time period to transition from death to be reincarnated into a new body or into a new life? Has there been any studies done on that that you know of?
I think people who investigate past lives, people like Jim Matlock and maybe Jim Tucker and Carol Bowman have got ideas. I did talk to a professor, Erlander Haraldsson, and he's in Iceland, and he found a case of a child with past life memories, and they worked out that the space between death and the child being born was 7 hours. But then if you look at James Leiniger, he died in the Second World War as a pilot, but he was born decades later. But then the tricky thing is, if there's no time in the afterlife space, there's no way of measuring a time between incarnations on that side. And there was also a guest I had on the podcast who takes people through past life regressions. And this person said, okay, I've died now, and my spirit guides told me that I haven't accomplished what I set out to accomplish. So I'm going to be reborn in 1958 into a new life. And suddenly thought, hang on a second, the previous life I saw, I was alive in 1958. That means I'd be living 2 lives at the same time, parallel lives. And they also said they saw their death when they was 90. But they thought, hang on a second, that means that's years ahead of now, and they can see their death when they're 90. It's like 20 years from now, they'll be 90. So they had this strange thing where it wasn't just seeing a past life in the past, they were seeing another life and what was happening to it in the future. So this idea of how much time there is between lives, I think nothing is set. It just is what it needs to be. You might be reborn within hours, you might be reborn within decades or hundreds of years.
Wow. Here's a question from Rudy Rudinsky, or a comment. I have a distinct past life memory as a German SS pilot in World War II who had killed many dozens of American and British bomber crews and their pilots. The pilot who looks much like I was at his age, grew tired of the constant killing. By the way, Rudy, you and I need to talk because I have that same type of a memory, same scenario, but his comment was, in his last moments of his life, shot through back and neck by an American fighter plane. The German pilot said, "Good, it's over," and he died. You ever heard anything like that in any of your podcast people?
No, nothing completely the same as that. I have talked to a guy on the podcast. It's funny, you know, I'm on the camera here in front of so many people and my mind goes blank with certain facts, but I talked to a guest who said that these kind of times where you have the Nazi camps and you have the Nazis, and you might think, why would you choose a life where you were a Nazi? And why would you choose a life where you were a victim of the Nazis? But these are enormous learning experiences for the soul. And he said in some cases, it's harder for the soul to choose to be the perpetrator than to be the victim. But it is quite sad that it may be that the souls that are on earth will need to go through a life of suffering because that will teach them something very powerful. So it may be that that's why there is suffering in the human race, that souls choose it.
Here's another question. Curious how mediums contact those who have passed if reincarnation exists.
I know. I've asked that question as well. I've had mediums on the podcast, and that's one of my standard questions for mediums. But you know, that's like takes me back to that what with Natalie Sudman said about having the wheel and all the spokes, and each spoke is a different life, and your personality is Robert and me, Simon and Yvonne. You know, when we die, I think it's like we're one of the spokes and we continue as a spoke on the wheel. And when you're incarnated into a new life, it's not that you or I directly go into that new life. It's like the soul puts a certain percentage of itself into that life, and the percentage that you are remains in the afterlife, because all of your knowledge and experience and everything you felt during the life you're leading now is so valuable to the soul. It doesn't want to send it somewhere else. It's trying to learn from it. And so that's what I think might be happening, is that the certain soul percentage goes into each life and keeps back the percentage that you are in the afterlife.
Here's another comment from Brigid. What about twins or triplets being regressed together as children?
Yeah, I hear about that. And also children, twins who have past life memories. I haven't done any regressions myself, taking twins back to past life memories. It's interesting, and it may be that it's just a choice. There's that idea that we're all part of a soul group, and it may be that somebody in your soul group needs to learn a certain lesson that can only be learned as a twin, and you say, yeah, sure, I'll be your twin in the next life. And I remember reading about two children who were arguing about how one of them wanted to be the son of their aunt and uncle, and having to go at the twin saying, you ruined everything. And it turned out that these children didn't know it, but their aunt and uncle, the mother had been pregnant with twins, but lost both the babies before they were born. So that was a strange connection between him saying, hey, you ruined everything. We were going to be the children of an aunt and uncle. So I don't know how he could have ruined everything, but that's interesting.
Thanks, Simon. Here's another one. It's from Tanya. I'm very interested in doing past life regression. Any suggestions about how to find someone?
Yeah, go on the internet. I take people through past life regressions, and Wendy Rose Williams, who's also part of the conference, she takes people through past life regressions. And you can find my website at pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. And there's a booking page there, and you can book a free 20-minute call. So, we can have a chat about it and see what you want to do. And it might be you decide I'm not the hypnotherapist for you and you'd rather work with someone else, and that's fair enough. But if you wanted to get in contact with me, I'll help you any way I can.
This is from Mindy. I'm curious whether you've encountered any stories of lives lived as other than human beings on Earth. Other animals, trees, stones, rivers, etc.
I have had people go to past lives on other planets. I haven't had anybody ever go to a past life as an animal or anything else. I had someone who briefly, I asked them to look down at their body, and they said they were naked, and then they went quiet, and I was waiting for them to talk, and they felt embarrassed to tell me, but they said, I haven't got a human body. I'm on this kind of wasteland. It's like a desert like you would see on Mars, and I'm naked and I'm not human. And then there was another person who said that I think they said they had 2 sets of knees on their legs, and they were hiding in a cave because these creatures were chasing her. And that was seemed like a past life as an alien.
Okay, well, there's a lot of comments over here. Do you believe this is from Nancy. Do you believe we have soul contracts before coming to the human experience?
Yeah, that seems to be how it all works. I say seems because I don't know for sure, and I'm confused about some things. But there's this group, soul group that you may be a part of, and that you work together to learn certain things, to have certain experiences. And you will get together with different members of the group and say, okay, I need to learn about loss. And the other person says, I need to learn about leaving someone. And so you think, okay, we could have a marriage, and I'll just go. And then you have to learn how to lose somebody, and you'll learn about loss. And so they have a soul contract that they will have this life together. And who knows what that contract would be? Because to me, I think, okay, we've got to get the lawyers in and we've got to start signing bits of paper. But I don't think it's, if that's quite what it means. And there's also past life vows I've heard of as well. So that is kind of the Michael Newton model, you might call it, of the afterlife, where you go into your soul groups and you choose which body you're going to live in when you're born. And you meet the council of elders, and you may go to a place of healing. So it's all very interesting stuff. But contracts do come up in past life regression. Sometimes contracts don't work out and you need to do some healing.
This one's from Evelyn from Philadelphia. Can a person's soul be in a reincarnation at the same time as they are visiting people with whom they lived in the most recent life?
Yeah, I think so. It goes back to that idea of the spokes on the wheel and being different lives, but part of the whole soul. So I don't see a problem with that. Some really good questions.
It's quite a few comments. You're going to have to take a look at these.
Yeah.
When does Simon broadcast? This is from Rocky. When does Simon broadcast? What's the link? I think you've already mentioned that, but when do you broadcast? The time? And...
Well, I've been putting episodes out, what is for me Sunday evenings, and they're on Apple, they're on Spotify, I think they're on Amazon now as well, and say Podbean, I think there's one. When I started out, I went on to like 30 different podcast sites where you can get to podcasts, and registered on all of them. So you could probably find the Past Lives podcast on any of those places.
And here again, I'm going to put in a plug for your show because it's fabulous. It's something you have to listen to. It's really good.
Thanks.
And I'm someone that, especially I came from a Catholic type background, and it's my life changed with my NDE experiences, and so this is all new to me. And you've had some great guests on there.
Yeah, I've been very lucky.
Let's see. This is from Bernadette. If the soul is our unique aspect of God, why would the soul need to grow and learn? As God is all, what more cold could there be to learn?
I know. It's interesting, isn't it? This is one of the questions. And I don't know if anybody's got the answer. What I read about, what I've talked about on the podcast with people, is there's that idea that each human life is unique and learns something, and that this source, so what you might call God, wants to know everything and experience everything. So the souls are out there, and that ultimately they're part of God. They're gaining all these experiences, and not just on Earth, they're getting their experiences on other planets and perhaps in other dimensions and other realities. And that the Earth is just a small part of all of this, and that God is not this kind of all-knowing super conscious that created the universe, but is just part of nature, and that maybe this God has thought, but is not a thinking being, and that it's trying to learn so much stuff. And though it is part of creation, but it's not like perhaps a guy with a big beard who suddenly decided to create a universe and planets and things.
This is one I think you covered, but it's from Terry. Question for Simon: can a person who has already reincarnated into a new body visit loved ones from their most recent life? Yeah.
And it's, I haven't got a picture here. One of the symbols on my podcast is it's like a man under a tree, and his arms are the branches, and there's all leaves on all the branches. And it's for me, that's kind of saying, if you look at a tree and all the leaves, each leaf is a different life, and the tree is your soul. and you can see that all the leaves are existing at the same time as your soul lives all those lives at the same time, and that because they're all happening at the same time in the afterlife space, that's not really reflected on the time as we experience it on Earth. So to have somebody in the afterlife who may be talking, through a medium to someone and have that soul experiencing a life that's actually happening on Earth at the same time is perfectly feasible.
Well, I tell you, the comments are just coming in. I got 82 more new messages, and we've got about 5 minutes left. So you've really opened up
a can of worms.
Quite a discussion, yes. And so many comments, thank you, Simon. I do like your ideas, possible explanations. This is for Bettina. I'm going to ask this for her. Do most people reincarnate in the same family, or that's not common?
Oh, they can do. Yeah, that's almost part of the soul contract thing where souls are working together and they say, perhaps in the next life, I'll be your son and you can be the parents, and I need to learn about this thing. So, we'll work on that, and they all agree to help each other. And it may be reciprocal that the child will then help the parents to learn about something else. But when I do past life regressions, what I always do is when somebody's in a past life, they may be at a dinner table in the Victorian era having dinner with their family. And I say, if you pay attention to everybody you're seeing in this scene, if you look at their energy and perhaps look in their eyes, do you recognize them as somebody who's incarnated with you in this life? And I often say, yes, I recognize them. The person who's my sister in this life was my brother in the previous life. And they may not see every family member and recognize them as somebody in this life, but almost always that recognition is there. And that is why we find about soul groups who are working together over the decades, over the lives, to learn things and experience things which will ultimately benefit the soul.
This is from, I can't pronounce the name. I believe this person's from Hungary. I think I remember that. K. Savan. Have you heard of any stories of a person's parents coming in the form of a person's own children?
That's interesting. Do you think they mean that a mother would give birth to herself, coming in the form of their own children?
I think that's what they're alluding to. Well,
I don't know. I suppose it could be possible if we can all live parallel lives and many lives at the same time. It's an interesting idea.
From Christina Rawls. Simon, how can I start training to become a regression therapist? What do you suggest?
Well, what I did, I trained to be a clinical hypnotherapist first. That was a few years ago. I did an extensive course in England that took 10 months. And it was through that I learned all the ideas of clinical hypnotherapy, where it was working with all sorts of things like weight loss and stopping smoking and fear of flying and all sorts of things. But when I did that, all I really wanted to know was how to do past life regressions. And so I went on to study that and get a certificate in that as well. I would say to start out you've really got to learn the basics. Don't do a course that only lasts a few hours. Do proper study and do proper practice with case studies. Where I studied past life regression therapy, I was linked to lots of other students and we all practiced on each other, and that was very beneficial because, they weren't expecting you to be a genius. They knew that you might make mistakes just like them. But because I've been a clinical hypnotherapist already, it seemed to work quite well. So that's what I'd say is get that first before moving into past life regression.
Since I last mentioned, we've got 99 new messages. I have to ask you this one. Were you a funk bass player that used to be in a band?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Somebody recognized you. What band was that, by the way?
Oh, there were several bands. a band called Constant Orange for years, and you know, did some great stuff. I was quite proud of the things we got onto.
Let me look here. We'll go one more. Maybe two more. What happens when a soul doesn't fulfill their soul contract? Example, commits suicide.
Well, it can be that it's just a decision is made to come back and to do that thing again. You know, as I mentioned earlier, there was somebody who's met the spirit guide after death, and they were, so you haven't accomplished what you set out to do, you're going to have to go back. There is this thing where it's always, nobody can force you to reincarnate, but the soul wants to learn, so it will choose to come back. And also it could be that suicide is part of what you are here for. It could be part of the plan of your life as a learning experience. And it may be that the people in your soul group agreed to be born with you in this life so that they could learn what it's like when somebody close to them commits suicide. So that can be part of the life plan, but also it can not be part of the life plan.
This is the last question. I know we've gone over time a little bit, but racism is such a big deal now. Are you confident that people choose to be different races via reincarnation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because you can learn so much. You know, you learn a life from being in India is going to be a lot different from learning a life in New York. And also having that experience of receiving some racism, being on the bad end of it, and also the experience of doling it out, these teach you things. This is what I was talking about earlier, about how it's maybe a sad thought that we'll need suffering for human beings because that's how the soul learns. I think that, you know, one thing to remember with reincarnation is that you have probably already been all these different things that you see around you. You've probably already had different colored skin. You've been a different gender. You've been gay. You've experienced all these lives. And so I sometimes wonder if the more advanced souls who've had so many lives on earth, these people are have more empathy for those around them and will treat those around them better because they have been the victims of all sorts of abuse. And so they have empathy for the ones around them. And it's the much younger souls that are the abusers. It's just an idea of mine. But yes, you have probably been every single race there is on the planet, and you've been male and female many times.
On behalf of Spiritual Awakenings International, Simon, you did a great job.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for your presentation today. I mean, it's just wonderful. And the comments are still coming in. It's amazing. You really touched the hearts of a lot of people, and you did a great job. And I want to just invite everybody to come back at the top of the hour. Dr. Bruce Greyson will be speaking then. But thank all of you that attended this. And we're looking forward to seeing you in about 10 minutes. So thank you. And thanks again, Simon. Great job.
It's been great. Thank you very much.